Good morning and welcome to China Now. I am Stanley Kwabla Arku. And in this edition, we take you to Huajiang Canyon Grand Bridge, the world's highest, where Professor Zhang Weiwei and Chief Engineer Mr. Zhu reflects on Guizhou transformation. Once an isolated and impoverished region, Guizhou now boasts over 9,000 kilometers of expressways and nearly half of the world's tallest bridges, earning the title World Bridge Museum. Huajiang Bridge, rising 625 meters above the river, stands as a symbol of China's drive to turn mountains into pathways of growth and opportunity.
Is a place where miracles are created. Barriered by rugged mountains, Guizhou had long been a secluded place throughout history. With its development hindered by inaccessibility, poverty rate here once peaked at 26.8%. However, through sheer determination and ambition, Guizhou has transformed its transportation and economy by prioritizing infrastructure development, especially bridge construction. In 2001, Guizhou had only 500 kilometers of expressways. By the end of 2024, this number exceeded 9,000 kilometers, making it one of the densest expressway networks in China. As the first province in western China to have each and every county connected by expressways, Guizhou is now hailed as a high-speed plain, with 10,000 bridges spanning its landscape. Today, nearly half of the world's top 100 tallest bridges are in Guizhou. Once deemed uninhabitable by UN experts, this region has rightfully earned the title World Bridge Museum. Truly, impassable gorges have become thoroughfares, laying a solid foundation for Guizhou's economic takeoff and improved livelihoods. We are now standing on the Huajiang Canyon Bridge. It holds the world record with a deck-to-water height of 625 meters, equivalent to a 200-story building, making it the world's tallest bridge without question. Building a bridge amid towering mountains first challenges the limits of human engineering, requiring overcoming at least three major hurdles. First, the challenge of ultra-strong wind fields. Wind speeds in the Huajiang Canyon change drastically. Gentle breezes can be instantly transformed by the valley effect into gusts reaching Beaufort scale 14. Chinese engineers used domestic LiDAR to monitor and analyze canyon winds, then developed a combined system of guide plates and dampers through 3D modeling and wind tunnel tests, ensuring the bridge stands firm amid gales. Second, complex geological conditions. Due to geographic constraints, the bridge site sits across 17 fault zones, described as driving piles into tofu. To tackle this, Chinese engineers pioneered deep-buried anchor technology, embedding a 200,000-ton anchor 120 meters into the rock stratum, a world record. Third, the challenge of bridge erection. Transporting massive components across such a wide, deep canyon is arduous. Moving factory-made parts to the site, precise assembling, hoisting to designated positions, and aligning them all posed significant difficulties. Guizhou's bridge marvels are numerous, from the Jiangjiehe Bridge to the Yaqihe Bridge, from the Beipanjiang Bridge to the Balinghe Bridge, and now the Huajiang Canyon Bridge before us. Over the past few decades, Guizhou has consistently demonstrated, with one cloud-piercing bridge after another, that there are no insurmountable mountains or rivers, only the continuous surpassing of one's own limits. This embodies a modern-day spirit of Yugong, the foolish old man, instead of moving mountains away, turning them into thoroughfares. Undoubtedly, in this process, China's new model of channeling national effort and resources onto key projects has played a crucial role. Government leadership, scientific research support, participation of both state-owned and private enterprises, coordination among more than 10 departments, including land resources, transportation, geology, meteorology, and research, mobilizing tens of thousands of engineers and builders. In the West, the planning phase alone could take 10 years without completion, whereas in China, it takes only 5 years from project initiation to completion. If this were undertaken in Western countries, it would likely take 15 to 20 years to finish. The construction of Guizhou's bridges has greatly benefited the people. Data shows that bridge building in Guizhou has directly created over 500,000 jobs and indirectly boosted output in industries like tourism and logistics by over 100 billion yuan. After the Huajiang Canyon Bridge opened, the travel time between its two banks was reduced from 2 hours to just 2 minutes. This has unblocked the arteries for economic development and made daily life more convenient for residents, effectively reshaping the definition of happiness. Where mountains were once synonymous with poverty, driving young people to seek work elsewhere, mountains connected by the bridge have now become a hotbed for entrepreneurship, with homestays, e-commerce, and eco-agriculture flourishing. From the initial planning stages, the bridge's builders innovatively proposed the concept of bridge tourism, creating the country's first complex that combines sightseeing, sports, and tourism services. The significance of the Huajiang Canyon Bridge also lies in its location on the Liu'an Expressway, a key node of the Western Land-Sea New Corridor. It connects Guizhou with Guangxi and Yunnan into a 2-hour economic circle, linking the mineral and tourism resources of southwestern China with the market and technology of eastern China. Furthermore, through Guangxi and Yunnan, it connects Guizhou to Southeast Asia. In 2023, Guizhou's trade with ASEAN exceeded 80 billion yuan, 60% of which was facilitated through this bridge corridor. This kind of hard connectivity is reshaping the economic geography of Western China. Guizhou, once an isolated and remote area, has now become a vital hub in southwestern China, connecting the Belt and Road Initiative, the Yangtze River Economic Belt, the Pearl River-Zhejiang River Economic Belt, the Chengdu-Chongqing Economic Circle, and the Guangdong-Hong Kong-Macau Greater Bay Area. Guizhou is a place where miracles are created. From its past of poverty and backwardness to today's vibrant development, it radiates charm. Guizhou is a province without natural plains, but it has now become a high-rise plain, elevated by thousands of bridges. Over the past decade, Guizhou's economic growth has consistently ranked among the fastest in China. Its big data industry is at the forefront nationally, and its comprehensive computing power is in the top tier. It also boasts the nationally and even internationally renowned Village Super League. Its cultural and natural landscapes are among the richest and most diverse in the world. Guizhou has skillfully played the cards it was dealt to achieve remarkable success, an incredible feat. In short, Guizhou is a latecomer in the Chinese path to modernization, but has achieved outstanding results. With rare courage and wisdom, the people of Guizhou have strived for progress and explored innovative paths, forging a successful modernization journey that suits their conditions, distinct from both eastern provinces and other western regions.
I began working in Guizhou's transportation system in 2005, so I have fully witnessed the massive development of transportation here, especially starting from 2012. The decade between 2012 and 2023 was our golden decade. At the end of 2011, our expressway mileage was only 2,000 kilometers. By 2015, we had achieved expressway connectivity to every county with 5,000 kilometers. We built an average of 600 kilometers of new road in the first 2 years, and that number rose to 1,000 kilometers per year in the latter 2 years, a remarkable speed even at national level. With these roads in place, Guizhou's economy and society entered a period of rapid development. We achieved road connectivity to every village by 2017 and road connectivity to every cluster of households by 2019. This means that many villages located on isolated hilltops, plateaus, and high ground, villages that previously had no roads connecting them to each other or to the administrative villages, were finally connected. We paved 79,000 kilometers of hardened roads to these household clusters. Furthermore, we had the 3-year water transport campaign starting in 2014, which removed navigation barriers, allowing our waterway transport to develop. Coupled with our high-speed rail, railways, and aviation, Guizhou has achieved remarkable construction milestones across its entire transportation sector. When we talk about roads, we must talk about our bridges and tunnels. Carve roads through mountains, build bridges across water. Roads require tunnels, but bridges are the most visible demonstration of Guizhou's transportation achievements. It is because of Guizhou's unique terrain that we have built over 30,000 bridges across 126,000 hilltops. We account for nearly half of the world's 100 highest bridges. This terrain dictates that our bridge construction differs from that of large rivers. Take the Huajiang Canyon Bridge, with its 1,420-meter span. It was built by prefabricating 110,000 individual steel members in a factory, transporting them to the site, and then assembling them section by section to form 93 segments. These segments were transported from the Zhenfeng County's roadbed via trolleys to the site, and then hoisted by a cable crane system, assembling them from the center outwards toward both sides, one section at a time, to form the bridge you see now. Thanks to advanced technologies like information control, automated control, positioning, and navigation, our assembly precision is incredibly high. The final closure precision was 2 millimeters, far exceeding the required standards. We didn't set out to create a world record for the sake of it. Bridge design involves many comparative factors: terrain, ecological environment, minimizing occupation of cultivated land, and a very important factor, Guizhou lacks funding, so we need to optimize project cost to the best of our abilities. In the preliminary design, the bridge span was only 1,360 meters. However, during the final design, geological issues were found, so we slightly shifted the bridge's angle to avoid the geological hazards, increasing the span to 1,420 meters, which unintentionally made it the world's largest span in a mountainous canyon. As for the height, we opted for bridge over tunnel. You see that tunnel over there, which is over 3,500 meters long. If we lowered the bridge's height, the tunnel would need to be longer, and the bridge span might be smaller. However, the cost of a long tunnel and a high bridge is similar, and excessively long tunnels compromise driving safety and comfort. Given these trade-offs, we preferred bridge over tunnel, which is how this world's highest bridge came to be. We also have many innovations in bridge construction. For this bridge, we face several issues. Firstly, because the span is so large, the saddle at the top of the tower for the main cable is very heavy and large. Traditionally, it would weigh over 400 tons. We decided to use a forged saddle, where thick steel plates are forged under high pressure into 50-centimeter thick plates, then welded and finally lifted and installed in 3 segments. The forging process actually changes the steel plate's microstructure, making it very dense. Casting does not require welding, but this did, demanding an innovation in welding technology. It was because we now have domestic manufacturers with such welding expertise that we dared to use this structure. Now, the world is starting to learn from us and use this structure. Another example is the 2 main cables, the bridge's most critical lifeline, which are impossible to replace once formed. We need to monitor and dehumidify the main cables, especially to prevent moisture from causing rust, which would be fatal. We implemented a smart main cable system. We removed 2 strands of the 5.7 millimeter steel wire and replaced them with optical fibers. One measures temperature, one measures humidity, and a third in the other cable measures stress. This created a smart main cable. These are just some of the many innovations on this bridge that the world is now adopting. We continue to innovate on our other bridges as well. It is thanks to these roads, bridges, and tunnels that Guizhou has been transformed into a high-speed plane, leading to its economic takeoff.
Now let's move into our final segment of the show, Thinkers Forum. This is where we step back from the headlines and engage with deep ideas, history, and reflection that shape our understanding of China and the wider world. Today we hear from a historian whose journey began with studying Japanese wartime propaganda and eventually led him into decades of research on how Japan's empire was received, remembered, and judged in East Asia. His story takes us through archives in Nanjing and Taiwan, into forgotten war crimes, tribunals, and towards questions that remain pressing even 80 years after the end of World War II. How should Japan's wartime legacy be remembered? How does it mean for Sino-Japanese relations today? And how do younger generations in both countries carry or forget this history? There's more.
I was initially interested in Japanese wartime propaganda, how the Japanese, in a sense, mobilized their own country to prepare for war and then to initiate war and expand empire overseas. And I was trying to look at what elements of Japanese society supported the militarization of society, and then what elements became militarized in their support of Japan's reach across East Asia in the expansion and advancement of its empire. So I started with that project about 30 years ago for my PhD dissertation. And as I was doing the dissertation, I grew more interested in the question of how was Japan's propaganda responded to outside of Japan. What was the reaction of people in the colonial lands of Korea and Taiwan? What was the reaction of people in the occupied areas that Japan took by force, or the occupied areas where they were met perhaps with a little more welcoming when they took the lands from European colonial powers? And so that became sort of the question of looking at Japan, not only from inside of Japan, but then looking at Japan from the outside. How was its empire received and treated as it expanded through the Chinese continent and into Southeast Asia? So that was the initial sort of historical questions that I was interested in. And the reason I actually got into the field of Japanese studies is a longer story. I'm not sure if that's what you want to hear, but I was an undergraduate in France, and I grew very interested in French wartime cinema. And no one had really looked into it very much. There were a few books. And as I grew interested in French wartime cinema, so what happened in France during the Nazi occupation with contemporary film, with films that people would watch on a daily basis. And as I grew interested in that, I thought, well, I'll look at Nazi era film, I'll look at Italian film, and oh, gee, what happened in East Asia? But I didn't know any Japanese. I didn't know any Chinese then. And I thought, well, I'll learn some Japanese. I didn't realize how hard it was going to be to learn Japanese. And so while studying Japanese, I ended up coming to Japan, and then I got more interested in Japanese history. That's really kind of how this whole project began 30 years ago, an interest in Japanese history. In terms of why I grew interested in the war more specifically, and then the immediate post-war with war crimes trials, that was more serendipity. That was by chance. I'd received a scholarship to do research in Nanjing for the summer. And unfortunately, the archives in China at that point, as they are now, were mainly closed. And the school libraries were fairly shut down as well. But the Nanjing University had a pretty good library, as did the Nanjing Municipal Library. And I came across a book. And the book was written by one of the KMT, one of the Chinese nationalist judges who had run a war crimes tribunal of several Japanese in post-war China. And I thought, oh, I've never heard of this. I didn't really ever think about, those of us who study Japanese military history tend to stay with World War II military history, until recently tend to go into the post-war necessarily. And I grew interested in the post-war, and then the question of, well, what happened to all these Japanese who were in China after the war? We know a lot about the Hikiagesha, so the Japanese, the civilians who were stuck in China at the end of the war, and then how they repatriated back to Japan and the trials and tribulations that they went through. But what about the Japanese military? How did the war end in China, and how was justice pursued? And because I had studied about the Tokyo war crimes trial in Japan under a well-known Japanese professor, Aoya Kentaro, I knew about that side of the equation. I knew what happened in Japan with the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal, but I didn't know much about what happened outside of Japan in war crimes tribunals. And it turns out not many people did. There wasn't that much research in any language, particularly in Chinese, but also in Japanese. There was a bit, in English, nothing about what happened in East Asia after the war that adjudicated Japanese war crimes, specifically for me in China, and then how did that influence Sino-Japan relations after the war? And because I came across this book in Nanjing, I started to dig, and I got more and more interested and began as much as possible to collect archives. I also went to Taiwan, and I was able to kind of further push into the question of what happened to these men. And because I started out as a historian of Japan, I'm interested in the history from both sides. So I'm interested in how the Chinese pursued Japanese war crimes, and I was interested in how the Japanese faced those war crimes, how they dealt with those war crimes, sometimes how they evaded them or how they accepted them. And what I came to realize is that this was not a question that was easily solvable in a very short book. So the first book I wrote on this topic, it's about 400 pages long, and there is a very nice Fantizi translation. Unfortunately, there's no Gentizi translation yet, even though people in China seem to be interested in it. I heard there was, but it still hasn't come out. I began to look at the KMT, the Chinese nationalist trials from 1946 to 1949. And as I went on into the research, I realized that the story continued after 1949. So I had to ask myself, even though the KMT is defeated and flees to Taiwan, and after 1949, it's the Chinese Communist Party that takes over what is called New China and establishes a kind of socialist republic, they then, 7 years after the end of the establishment of New China in 1956, hold another set of war crimes trials of the Japanese. And I thought, it's not really two books. It's one book. I need to do the story from 1945, the end of the war, to 1956 and ask, why is there this long durée, 11 years, of pursuing Japanese war criminals in various ways and using different legal means to perhaps the same ends of finding justice for Chinese compatriots after the war. And I then was comparing not only the Sino-Japanese history, but also the history of these two different sets of war crimes trials. The KMT produced trials and the CCP produced trials in 1956. So this is the 80th year of the end of World War II. I would encourage listeners to think about Japan's war in East Asia and the war of resistance against Japan without using the term anti-fascist. I don't think that Japan was ever actually a fascist country. It needs to be differentiated in terms of how we remember it from the way in which Italy and the way in which Nazi Germany were run. But of course, many in China, particularly in the KMT and the CCP, guerrilla armies had an anti-Japan resistance military stance, but there was no anti-fascism necessarily, and I would sort of stress that. So it's the 80th year of the end of the war, and it's important to remember, as Professor Kitoka Shinichi, a scholar and former diplomat of Japan, has said, that Japan's war was an aggressive war, and that Japan invaded China, and that needs to be remembered, and that needs to be recalled, and that history, while it's being investigated and detailed, does that historical responsibility in legal or moral terms still lay on the shoulders of young Japanese today? And that's a question that I think we need to debate and discuss more. I think there is a fairly poor memory of the pain and suffering that the Japanese military at that time caused in China and elsewhere in East Asia and Southeast Asia. However, that doesn't mean that there aren't many individuals in Japan at the personal and local level that are trying to recall and remember and investigate this. At the forefront of international scholarship on Japan's responsibility and Japanese actions during World War II, it's mainly Japanese scholars still, and of course, Chinese scholars in Japan that promote this sort of research. And I think that needs to be remembered. Maybe Western scholars are known slightly better in different parts of the world because we write in English, but our scholarship and our findings are often built on the backs of excellent Japanese scholarship. I think this year, the 80th year, was a missed opportunity for both Japan and China, the People's Republic of China, to talk about issues related to the 80th year end of the war. Certainly because of the political issues in Japan with a weak prime minister who just resigned and a cabinet that was about to fold, there didn't seem to be time, nor was it the place for the Japanese cabinet to really issue a strong statement of recognizing the history and suffering that Japan had caused more than 80 years ago in China and elsewhere in East Asia. At the same time, it's the 80th year of the end of World War II. This is a long time, right? The generation that was responsible for the war and the generation that took part in that war has all but disappeared, both in Japan and China and elsewhere. And I was thinking about this in preparation for this discussion. In 20 years, it'll be the 100th anniversary of the end of World War II in East Asia. I'll be 77 years old. Hopefully, I'll still be alive if all goes well. We don't succumb to global climate change and other issues in the world. And I was thinking, what do I want to remember? What do we want to, what should we remember in 20 years from now, the 100th anniversary? Should we be recalling the same stories about the war that we recalled at the 50th anniversary or the 75th anniversary or the 80th anniversary? Or should we be telling those stories and remembering those events in addition to something else? And for me, it's that in addition to something else that I think we're forgetting. That there's an opportunity in the 80th year of the end of the war, a changeover from one generation to the next, to think about not only Japan's aggressive war and war responsibility, but about how different Japan and China are today. Now, China has manifested this difference fairly well, I think, with its parade on the 3rd of September demonstrating a very strong military. I don't think that that was necessarily the way to go. I don't think it achieved perhaps the results that the government wanted, but nonetheless, that's what it decided to do. On the other hand, there's Japan. Japan didn't have a parade on August 15th. It didn't issue a statement, but it also didn't issue any statement denying the end of the war, which is a positive thing. And one has to think of how different Japan is 80 years after the end of the war than the aggressive Japan of 1945. Japan has self-defense forces, but it still is bound by Article 9 of the Constitution, which a majority of the people do not want to change. So it's a pacifist constitution, which allows it to have defense, but no offensive military. And Japan arguably has been a very positive role for stability and economic growth, not only economic growth and stability for China, but economic growth and stability for the rest of East Asia. And I think that part of the conversation needs to start being included in future war memorials after this year. Because at the 100th year anniversary of the end of World War II, what I would like to see is Japan and China standing on the stage together, talking about mistakes of the past and responsibility for the past, but also the future. And for me, that was a failed opportunity at this 80th year. So when we talk about using history as a mirror for the present in both China and Japan, I think we really have to do that. We have to look at ourselves and look at how things have changed and acknowledge that change while accepting responsibility of the faults of the past. I don't think that's necessarily happening in Japan, and I don't think that's necessarily happening at all really yet in China. The past of Japan's behavior in China is being used as a bludgeon to remind Japanese of the past and the present. And that's not having the desired impact that I think a lot of Chinese politicians, Chinese bureaucrats would hope. There needs to be a different methodology and a different way forward to think about Japan's aggressive past while juxtaposing it with the peaceful Japan that Japan has become today. Well, I think it's relatively easy to see in Japan that modern Japanese history is not taught very well. We can talk as much as we want about politics and responsibility for the past, but generally your average young Japanese student is not really aware of what happened in World War II, and nor do they much care. Fair enough. It's not really relevant to their lives. I would argue that for many young Chinese as well, World War II is not necessarily relevant to their lives as well. I'm always struck by this duality when I talk to young Chinese people or students. They know a lot about the war because it plays a large role in the Chinese curriculum, but they also are very interested in Japan. And they like to travel to Japan, they like to study in Japan. So there's a real duality in terms of what they're taught about the nature of Japanese military bestiality during the war, and of course, what they know about contemporary Japanese popular culture and what they see on TV and what they like about contemporary Japan. They're able to balance that. I'm afraid perhaps that balance is not happening in Japan. Very nationalistic, patriotic education about the war is producing in China, from the Japanese angle, are Japanese who are not really interested in China. Young Japanese are studying Chinese and Chinese culture and Chinese history less and less each year. And that is a recipe for future disaster, I think. China is an extremely important partner for Japan's future, but also for the future of East Asia and for the future of many in the global world, of course. China plays a significant role, much different than it did 20 or 30 years ago. And for Japan's closest neighbor to ignore Chinese history and Chinese language and culture, I think will be a detriment. So one way to help change for the future is to assist young Japanese to think about studying Chinese and Chinese history, but also to help Chinese history in China not be so nationalistic and strident that it pushes others away from wanting to engage. And I think that's precisely the impact of the September 3rd parade, which has confirmed the worst fears of a rising militaristic China. And that fear has become palpable, perhaps, or that fear has risen in Japan. And I think that's a further recipe for disaster. So I think those two issues, education on both sides, less nationalism, and more engagement, are one way of assuaging this problem or kind of ameliorating this problem as we move forward. I mean, we've done a lot of work on Japanese atrocities, scholarship from across the globe in Chinese, English, French, German, Korean, etc. And I think the parameters of wartime atrocities are fairly well known. Lesser known aspects, or aspects that we're still picking up, I think would be Unit 731. Of course, there's the well-known Chinese film that just came out. It was supposed to come out earlier and it didn't, so which is an interesting moment unto itself, the decision of the timing. I haven't seen it. It hasn't been released here yet. And when I was in China a few months ago, it wasn't released. I've read about it, of course. It stars the famous brother of director Zhang Weiwei, among others. So there's popular films that have come out about the topic, raising the awareness. The use of bacteriological and chemical warfare by the Japanese military in China and elsewhere has been documented, but we don't know as much about that as atrocities on, let's say, POWs or whatnot. So I think scholarship on those aspects is still developing as we uncover new archives, as we conduct more interviews, and as archives are declassified, and also as archaeological evidence is unearthed in various parts of China as well. I think one aspect where we have much less understanding is what happened to Chinese POWs. So we always talk about Allied POWs. And when I say Allied POWs, we often mean those from the West, how they were abused, how they were incarcerated in Japanese POW camps. What we don't often hear about, in English at least, and perhaps outside of China, is what happened to Chinese POWs. Now, we know that many Chinese POWs are killed on sight for several reasons. One, because they could have been communist sympathizers, and the Japanese military labeled them as what we'd call non-combatants, so they didn't believe they were official military soldiers, so they just killed them on sight. Others were actually taken as forced laborers around parts of the Japanese Empire, so we end up strangely with a collection of Chinese communist soldiers, KMT soldiers, and Chinese coolies taken as forced laborers all the way down to Rabaul in Papua New Guinea in the later years of World War II. They're finally liberated at the end of the war, and the Allies are kind of trying to figure out why you guys all the way down here and who are you? Because they didn't really know that Chinese KMT soldiers and CCP guerrilla soldiers had been taken against the laws of war as forced laborers in some parts. So there exists a whole history there that we've sort of dug into, but not quite. And this is different than civilian Chinese forced laborers who are brought to all the companies and mines and various military sites in Japan, of whom we know there are about 40,000. What I'm talking about is the Chinese military. The Chinese military men who fought against the Japanese, what happened to those men? Again, most were killed either in action or after, but we don't really have any concrete records from either side. We have some testimony here and there, and we have some huilu, some memoirs of Chinese and Japanese, but nothing really concrete. And I think that's one of the aspects, perhaps for further investigation and historical analysis, is where did all these Chinese soldiers go? Of course, we know that tens of thousands were killed, not just in battle, but afterwards. But how and why, and what were the means, and what were the ideas behind the killing? It's quite a lot of people, and it kind of just gets pushed aside in history. And I would like to personally know more about that, as I'm sure a lot of other viewers and budding historians would also be interested in. The first book on this topic that I wrote, Men to Devils, Devils to Men, was trying to reconstruct the history of what the Chinese and Japanese were facing in the China theater at the end of the war. And every country that was involved in World War II in East Asia, whether they can or they can't, whether their budget allows for it, whether they have the legal staff to do it, whether they can get the courts up and running, they all realize they need to have war crimes tribunals of the Japanese, because they need to compete with every other country in East and Southeast Asia that's having war crimes trials. So the Chinese see that there's a war crimes tribunal in Tokyo, and of course they send staff there. They see that there are war crimes tribunals happening in the rest of Southeast Asia by the British, by the Dutch, by even the French in Indochina, and by the Australians. And they realize they cannot avoid having their own trials of the Japanese. But they face several problems. The first problem they face is that China is a country facing catastrophic problems after the war. 100 million refugees, no food, economy is in shambles. The government is in shambles, right? The KMT is there, but of course the CCP is pushing against it, and the Soviet Union has come down from the north as well. And there are very soon 80,000 US Marines helping out in China as well, but somewhat creating more instability in certain major urban areas. So it's complete chaos. And within that chaos, the Chinese are tasked, or they task themselves, with finding evidence that hadn't really been procured that much, because the Chinese weren't necessarily thinking of their own trials. They were thinking of sending the data and evidence to Tokyo for the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunals. But eventually they realized the KMT needs to have its own trials to prove to the domestic Chinese population that a change has occurred, that the Japanese military is out, that Japanese occupation is finished, and that the KMT is back, it's in charge, and it can bring justice to the Japanese war crimes for the Chinese people. So it's paramount for the KMT at that time to demonstrate domestically that it has a handle on justice. It knows how to find and seek out justice for Chinese people. But it's also important for the KMT to demonstrate internationally that it is the correct authority for the proper management of post-1945 China. Because even though Chiang Kai-shek is there on the international stage, not many of the major European and American powers have faith in the KMT. So the KMT, in some ways, are going to use the theater of the stage of war crimes tribunals to demonstrate their understanding of international law, to persuade two populations, domestic and international populations, that the KMT is back and it's in power. That's in a sense, that's the first problem. The second problem is that there's a huge shortage of staff. The best qualified Chinese legal staff go to or are sent to the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal. There is still tertiary staff around China, but everything is dislodged. Right? Where do they hold the trials? Many major buildings are destroyed. And so they have to kind of figure out where and when and how, and what cities and what crimes to pursue. And they need to do this all quickly. The third, I think, issue they face, and this is perhaps what sets KMT Chinese nationalist trials apart from other trials, is they're not vengeful. Chiang Kai-shek declares very quickly in August 16 that the phrase is used later. He doesn't use it in his actual speech, but it's 以德报怨. So they are going to repay Japanese malevolence with Chinese benevolence. In a sense, they're going to be nice to those they've conquered. Now, it's pragmatic. You still have several million Japanese soldiers residing until they get repatriated back home in China. Let's also remember that fundamentally, the Chinese military does not defeat Japan. The Japanese military surrenders and it is defeated, but that defeat is generally to the Allies and mainly to American military power in the Pacific. For all intents and purposes, Japan has not lost. I mean, basically it loses one battle, but it's fundamentally not lost the war in China. When the Japanese imperial military lays down its arms in China, it is still the main military force. Therefore, Chiang Kai-shek and the KMT need to be pragmatic about how they deal with the Japanese, but they also want to treat the Japanese with benevolence because they want to secure a positive post-war relationship with Japan. They want to trade again with Japan. Japan is exceedingly important in China's quest for modernity, even after the war. So there are many reasons behind Chiang Kai-shek's choice for this kind of benevolent repayment of Maleb or Japanese violence in East Asia. And they face all those problems. And I might make them sound small here, but they're enormous. The KMT doesn't even really get started procuring Japanese war criminals and starting Japanese war crimes trials of the Japanese until after the Americans have done so in Shanghai. So the Americans have trials first of Japanese war criminals in Shanghai who abused and killed American servicemen. And then the Chinese further realized we really need to get things started, because how can we allow Americans to have war crimes tribunals in China? China is now sovereign. So the Americans had kind of neglected the fact that China had fully regained legal sovereignty in 1943 as part of the deal that everyone made so that China would really join the war effort and be treated as an equal. And so America ignores that and has trials in Shanghai, which irritates the Chinese. And there are kind of many other interventions by different countries, the British and the French, all trying to kind of have their own trials on Chinese sovereign territory. And so it's very important for the KMT to delineate what its geographic territory is. What is the territory of China? And one way to also do that is through war crimes tribunals. Because if you think about it, a war crimes tribunal says, if you commit this crime here, then it's in our land. If you commit a crime over there, well, that's not our sovereign territory, that's the next country over. And so the war crimes trials also help create or reassert a new geographic map of post-war China in a way that reminds the Allies this is China. So, the political considerations in there are that China needs to show both its domestic population and internationally who's who and that we're in charge now. But it really also demonstrates to the Japanese, at least the attempt by the KMT, is to demonstrate that they are pursuing justice, not vengeance. And it's very interesting to recall, if one doesn't know, that in Japan, at the time, several years after the post-war, there are various monuments and shrines to Chiang Kai-shek around Japan, thanking him and the KMT for the benevolence they showed the Japanese after the war, that they didn't pursue a policy of vengeance, that they pursued a policy of justice, and that the Japanese were mainly allowed to return home and repatriate. So that had a very positive effect. And that effect and that policy will have a huge impact on Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai's policy about their own war crimes trials in 1956. They are heavily criticized at the time. Let's not forget, for all of Chiang Kai-shek's pragmatic and benevolent policies, the KMT is intensely corrupt. And that corruption is seen by the Japanese. Conditions in the prisons, conditions in the courtroom, not very good. Generally, it's a very negative image of KMT war crimes tribunals. Not everybody, but mostly. Now, of course, let's not forget they're taking place in a country that's just been at war for basically 14 years and invaded. So how good can the conditions be? Lack of translators, lack of proper evidence, lack of chain of command of evidence, the ability of the judges, etc. All of that is in Japanese memoirs and accounts afterwards. So in Japan, there was the bureau, the Ministry of Justice had a bureau, and in that bureau, they went around and they interviewed former Japanese war criminals all over the country. And generally speaking, I mean, no country comes out well for having its treatment of Japanese war criminals, including America. I think each country would like to think it treated Japanese war criminals well. Most didn't. There's some horrifying stories from the American side and from the British side as well. So I'm not necessarily sure that the Chinese trials and treatment of Japanese war criminals are any worse, but the memory of them by Japanese seems to have been worse. Generally not well respected legally or as legal cases. But going back to your point about Japan's lack of the use of surrender in its end of war statement, laying down their arms, I think it's important to remember that the Japanese political elite, civilians theoretically running the country and the military, and then the emperor, are all a bit unsure of what will happen if and when the war ends. They didn't necessarily trust themselves. It's one of the reasons the emperor has to record the message, and it's in the emperor's voice. Because if any other person had released the message, if the government or even if the top military leaders had released the message, then some in the military in China or other parts of the fringes of the empire would have said, well, we're not going to go with this guy. We don't believe him. We're going to be loyal to this general or something. So it had to be, in a sense, the emperor. And they're worried about, are the Japanese soldiers really going to lay down their arms? So by saying it's an imperial order, and by calling it the end of the war, not surrender, it allows millions of Japanese soldiers abroad, particularly in Japan, in China, and Manchuria, to lay down their arms peacefully, relatively peacefully. The fighting still goes on in some parts, but generally speaking, it's a pragmatic strategy to allow that to happen. So I think that was a fairly good tactic, a fairly positive tactic to take. Otherwise, they weren't quite sure what was. I mean, it demonstrates the lack of trust, really, among Japanese imperial troops, and what perhaps could have happened and turned into more of a catastrophe. Well, sadly, I don't think they have much impact internationally. I'm not sure if anybody outside of the Chinese-speaking world watches them. I know that they were seen by millions in China, and I think we did a good job. I'll give you a story first about the situation in 2008. So in 2008, when I was first in Nanjing and first became interested in the Chinese war crimes tribunals of the Japanese, I gave a talk at the end of my stay in bad Chinese, and the audience was very nice to me. And I thought only a few people would be there, and about 40 graduate students of varying levels were there. And these are graduate students who have deep knowledge of Chinese history, a deep knowledge of politics. And I asked them, did China have a judge on the seat, on the stage at the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal? And no one could answer. No one knew at that point, or no one was thinking about China's role in the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal. And therefore, when talking about the BC class tribunals, right, those lesser class tribunals that were all over East Asia that we were just talking about, no one knew about those either. A few years later, because there was a film, the Dongjing Shanpan film, and then they had the Dongjing Shanpan 那个研究中心 at Shanghai Jiaotong Daxue, people began to learn more about what had happened in the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal from the Chinese perspective, but also what was going on in China. But in 2008, no one knew. So I think the documentaries that we made, I made first with the Shanghai media and then with Jiangsu media, I think they've opened up some avenues of understanding about what was China's role in adjudicating wartime responsibility and justice toward and with Japan. I think that's very important. I wish there were a Japanese version. Unfortunately, there's no Japanese version. I think it's very important. Japanese NHK, national broadcaster here, and other TV media are interested and often do excellent documentaries about Japan's empire, Japan's aggressive war, and they interview a lot of individuals and they put that on the web. And I think this would have been an interesting parallel for them to see the situation from the Chinese side. In terms of people viewing it in the West, one of the issues that scholars who do the history of East Asia that we face in the West is that there's no interest. I have found much less interest in my scholarship and the documentaries in the UK and America, and much more in Korea, Taiwan, China, and Japan. And I think a Korean version would also be important and interesting. There's a whole range of Korean war criminals, and the Korean issue in post-war East Asia is also a very difficult issue to unravel. And they're beginning to talk about it now more freely in Korea as well.
And that brings us to the end of this edition of China Now. I am Stanley Kwabla Arku. Thank you for joining us here on Pan-African Television. Be sure to share your thoughts and stay with us for more in our next episode. Until then, good morning.